Thank you. The book this is the first, yesterday was the first time I saw this. I haven't seen, somebody was kind enough to carry a few samples from Delhi. The cover is an image of the Samudra Manthan, which is a story in our ancient texts about the two opposing forces, the Devas and Asuras, cooperating for a common project. So it's also a cooperation between opposites, the pairs of opposites, rather than reconciling by one knocking out the other, good permanently knocking out evil, as in the Abrahamic traditions. In the Hindu traditions, that never happens. There's always a balance between the two. Someone pointed out, why did you use figures that are not looking Indian? And I mentioned that this is not about India-centric. The myth, the stories, the itihas, the dharma are an alternative claim to universalism. It's an alternative to the Western claim of universalism. So there's nothing wrong if if the Samudra Manthan were depicted with Western people, African people, Chinese people, it would be valid because it's a universal claim. Now, I want to tell you a few things which I'll just go through a few points I've written down. The churning paradigm has several significances. First, it represents my own churning that I went through to come up with ideas, then challenging ideas, more doubt, churning, coming up with newer insights, and so on. And this process involved a lot of debates, discussions, arguments with people who are from my tradition and also people who are from other traditions. And the other traditions that I've argued and debated and had many, many conversations with are Catholics and Protestants and secular scientists who are atheists and postmodernists who don't believe in any of this. And from within the tradition, I've had the honor to work with Sri Aurobindo scholars, Kashmir Shaivites, Vaishnavites, Advaitins, and Marxists. And so the list of endorsements we've got covers all of these. This is because I've been very honest and transparent in saying this is the view, now what do you think? And then accommodating that view where they are right, admitting it, and then going back to the drawing board to construct another thesis. This kind of a process is not alien to our tradition. We call it the Purva Paksha, which means the study of the other. So in the classical times, the Purva Paksha was, the Hindus would do Purva Paksha of the Buddhists, and the Buddhists with the Hindus, and the one school of Vedanta with another school of Vedanta, and so on. And somehow, the tradition of Purva Paksha got lost in recent centuries. Today, when they teach Vedanta in an academy, they're still teaching the old debates with Buddhists, whereas what is called for is new debates with the Christians, and the new debates with the secularists, and the new debates with the postmodernists. So where is the Purva Paksha for that? I ask everybody. I've asked the Ardhadas to Sri Ravi Shankar. I've asked that to a lot of gurus. And where is your Purva Paksha of the West? That is what you have. The Purva Pakshin is no longer the Buddhist today or the Jain. I mean, that's not that's not the people who are at the gates, so to speak. So the Purva Paksha is this interaction to really study the other in an authentic way, and not a flippant way, not a kind of a smart aleck way, not a gotcha way, but a really honest way, and then give a response which is our Siddhanta. So you need Purva Paksha of the other and Siddhanta. So this book is my many years of Purva Paksha, both with those inside the tradition and those outside the tradition, and my Siddhanta as a result of it. Now, what makes it particularly challenging? Firstly, this kind of project, I'm not aware, has been attempted. And to whatever extent it is successful in your eyes after you've looked at it, the point is I couldn't find a serious Purva Paksha of this kind. More than a century ago, Dayanand Saraswati did this with his knowledge of Christianity at the time. 100 years ago, Mahatma Gandhi wrote Hind Swaraj, a pamphlet, which was Dharmic Purva Paksha of British colonialism. Sri Aurobindo did some of that in his early years. Radha Krishnan did some of that. K.D. Setna, who was 105 when he just passed away, did that. I met him when he was 94 and really got a charge with talking to him for several hours in Pondicherry, where he told me about his debates with the Teilhard de Chardin, because a lot of people were claiming that Teilhard de Chardin had already discovered what Sri Aurobindo was saying. So his whole argument against that was a very strong one. And also Beat Griffiths, who was saying that Christianity has all these Vedantin ideas already. So he had a letter correspondence with Beat Griffiths, which was published in a book. So this was very inspiring to me, that here is a modern real Purva Pakshin, but unfortunately he is no more. Now, the Purva Paksha also involved, this churning has also involved a lot of internal dissent. Every time I take a view with a Westerner, he says, who do you represent? And they're smart, they know, they've done their study of us. Do you represent this group or that group or that group and that group? So the idea is to fragment the dharmic side so that I cannot speak for anybody. And since I have no foundation to stand on, nothing common, therefore I am gone. That's a very easy way to dismiss, and a lot of Hindus actually get embarrassed and then they stop the Purva Paksha. So if I would bring in the Sri Aurobindo view as the view I'm representing, then I would have a problem with Vaishnavites saying, well, we don't accept that. And if there's a Vaishnava view I would bring as my dharmic view in order to debate the Western thought, then a Shaivite might say, this particular aspect or that, or Arya Samaji would say that this is totally wrong. So finding the common ground internally within the Dharma traditions has been a very serious challenge. And I believe that this book has addressed that need. Very conscious that there is this issue, and very conscious that I have to not only include the Buddhists, but Hindus, but Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs to a large extent, and find common ground that with some exceptions and some amount of arguments that people are certainly going to throw at me, in large measure represents a certain common dharmic position from where one can stand and have a contrast with the Western tradition. Same problem also exists on the Western side. People have asked, well, what is the West? Which West? Who's the West? Who speaks for the West? And I understand all that. And I therefore make a distinction between whether I'm talking about Catholic theologian or Eastern Orthodox or Protestant theologian or Western Enlightenment or postmodernism, and that kind of nuancing is done. So it's not like an essentialized Dharma and an essentialized West. It is not as simple as that. Now, the reason to do this is that this project is that we are so colonized that if you writing a book on Introduction to Dharma, which has no reference to the West, which is commonly how people are teaching. The gurus are saying, why should I worry about others? Truth is inside me. I'll only teach the truth. Why I don't even want to bother about others. The assumption there is that we are starting on a clean slate, but we are not starting on a clean slate. Many speakers have helped make my point that we are already so preconditioned with the colonial framework and the colonial paradigm that unless you are conscious that people in general already make those assumptions, you cannot do away with that. You cannot decolonize unless you are conscious of the toxicity that you want to remove. So you have to study the toxicity or whatever has invaded or colonized in order to be able to make decisions on how we want to not be that. So this neti, not this, of the West is an important process that I'm following here. So everywhere I go, I make a contrast with what is the Western position and what is the dharmic position. And the difference is not a matter of superiority, difference is a matter of difference. Because in our tradition, difference is the very essence and nature of the cosmos, nothing to be apologetic. The fact that we are different doesn't mean that one of us is inferior, we just happen to be different. Like different cuisines, different genre of music, different kinds of species of animals and plants and flowers. So there's different cultures and different worldviews, and there's nothing wrong with that. So this difference is not a difference from superiority. It is a difference in order to put a seat at the table for a tradition that has not been given a proper seat at the table. And in order to get that seat at the table, it has to do this Purva Paksha of the others who've been in control of the discourse. So so therefore the kind of things that I ran into in doing this project are things like, Dharma is a way of life. So we're done. So I would say, yeah, but the drug culture is a way of life. The Taliban is a way of life. I mean, every living thing has a way of life. An elephant has an elephant way of life. Snake has a snake way of life. So I don't know who doesn't have some way of life. So it doesn't say anything. You have to tell me what way of life and what is distinct about the way of life and what is excluded from that way of life. And otherwise, it's like saying, you know, a pen is defined as a collection of molecules. Now that doesn't really say anything because it could be a bicycle also. It could be anything. So you have to be specific about what collection of molecules and what about the configuration and what about the way it's set up makes it a pen. Otherwise, it's just a very generic piece of matter. So a way of life is a useless definition, and the reason I'm belaboring this point is it's a very common, proud definition of a lot of people saying, when you say, well, we're trying to define dharma and trying to define Hindu identity, a lot of hands go up and a lot of people say, well, you know, it is a way of life. And they think everybody gets applauded and they think the job is done. But to define it as a specific way of life, you must delineate what it is not, which means you must do purva paksha of the other and say it's a way of life that excludes these things and includes these things, and you have to have the courage to be able to say that. Then you hear things like, common things like love everyone, or all paths are valid, every path leads to the truth. Then people say, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which means the whole world is one family, so why are we bothered? Then I tell them that, you know, the Kauravas and Pandavas were also one family. And the Devas and Asuras are also one family. So the fact that we are all one family actually is not only humans' family. When we say Vasudeva Kutumbakam, we are talking about all sentient beings as a family. The whole cosmos is a family. But that doesn't mean that you negate difference. It is a family, but there's distinct. Even in my family, mother and father are not identical. And brother and sister have different roles. So a family doesn't mean identical clones. So some of these common statements and very simplistic, simple-minded things that people say, it's surprising the extent to which people get away with it in discourse, in scholarship, certainly gurus who talk at the popular level just full of this kind of stuff, and they get away with it. So I take that to task. One by one, I take all these kind of positions to task. I take to task what I consider to be a misinterpreted Advaita Vedanta position, very commonly heard, that since ultimately it's all mithya and all illusion, so it doesn't really matter. So I had one guy telling me that, and so he was a doctor, so I said then, you know, whether you give 10 milligrams of this medicine or 100 milligrams, it should make no difference, because it's all mithya. And so the guy said, no, but he could fall ill, you know, he could die. I said, but death, life, it's all mithya. Why are you worrying? And so the guy said, but I could get in trouble, you know, I may get sued, I may get in jail. I said, but whether you're in jail or out of jail, it might make it. The point being that when people are making personal decisions in their own selfish life, in their own physical world, they are very conscious that there is difference. There are these things matter. There is dharma and there is adharma according to our tradition. But when they have to work hard to answer these questions and they are lazy, then they come up with these quick, glib one-liners as a kind of way of escaping. So I don't accept these kind of simple answers. And similarly, the postmodern critique I have here is that postmodernism leads to nihilism, because while it keeps negating this, negating that, there is no place it stands. There is nothing positive it affirms. So how to use the postmodern critique against a very exclusivist Western Enlightenment and Abrahamic tradition, and yet not end up in nihilism, but end up in a different kind of a paradigm which does not suffer from the same critique. That is a challenge, one of the challenges that I meet in this book. So I critique postmodernism, I utilize postmodernism up to a point, but I do not end up with the postmodern solution, I also critique it. Now, the difference that I looked at all the conditions of all the different kinds of difference. And I coined a lot of phrases in this book. One of the phrases I coined is difference anxiety. Difference anxiety is the anxiety of somebody that, you know, I'm different from you. It could be racial, could be gender, could be, religious, any kind of difference. And I talk about why this difference anxiety is not normal and not natural, and why you can have difference and even celebrate difference. That's a whole different way of approaching it. But the difference anxiety can either be from superiority or inferiority. So this superiority difference is sort of like, I'm right, I'll colonize them, make them like me, I'll convert them, make them like me, I'll genocide them to eradicate them so they don't even exist, I got rid of difference that way, or I'll enslave them and put them in their place. So this inability to deal with difference in a comfortable manner from a position of superiority leads to all these kinds of things which has happened in history. And equally dangerous, maybe more so, is this difference anxiety from a position of inferiority, where the person says, I'm inferior because I'm not like these guys. These guys are superior and I ought to mimic them, I ought to copy their language, their style, their epistemology, their institutional affiliation, because that makes me legitimate and that gets me a boost in my career. I see that in Delhi. Domestic help from a village will come, and I go and say namaskar to the children, and the guy will say to his daughter, say good morning to Saab. I'll say, I'm saying namaskar, but he's embarrassed of the difference, of his own tradition. And the help in my mother's house, the most important thing they're negotiating with my mother is that she should make sure that they get into an English school. And the girl should be wearing a Western dress, and she should learn English. So this idea of mimicking upward in the strata, of social strata, is the difference anxiety from below. So difference anxiety is not just the problem of hegemony from above, it is also inferiority complex from below. And so this business of, then another thing that I've run across is this idea that truth is one, therefore universalism, and what's wrong with it. And so my whole book, which says an Indian challenge to Western universalism, I got a response from a very helpful, nice note from a dear friend of mine who's a well-known philosopher, very well-known philosopher, said, why are you upset at universalism? I said, you didn't read carefully. I said Western universalism, because it's an oxymoron. If it's to be universal, then you're saying Western universalism, then you should be saying Western parochialism. Because the Western is not universalism, it is just one claim of universalism. And because the West has taken its history, and thanks to Hegel, made a template of universal history that everybody goes through these stages, and taken their philosophy and their experience and said that therefore this is universal philosophy, we have accepted it as universalism. So the English language is full of that. For instance, a nice day is sunny and bad weather is rain. But if you're living in a place which really badly needs rain, because there's a lot of drought, then rain is something to be celebrated. And a sunny, hot day may actually be not that nice. So it's the London, weather, which has kind of become universalized in the English language. There used to be a time when the British proudly said, the sun never sets on the British Empire, which means that their empire is all over the world, so there's always sun somewhere. But the weather being such that today the sun hardly ever rises in Britain, because it's mostly cloudy. So the universalizing of this very limited people's experience and history and ideas, and spreading it to the world, is in fact what colonization is. So if you want to decolonize, you got to critique universalism. And you have to, so that does not mean that there is no universal truth. That means that there may be another claim to that universal truth. There may be such a thing as a Vedic universalism. There may be a claim to that. Now we already have a Chinese claim to an alternative universalism, Confucianism. There is a Professor Tu Wemming in Harvard. I've done part of my churning and all is with Tu Wemming. He believes that the Confucian ethic is an alternative to the Protestant ethic on which the West is based. That's his view. And he believes that China's modernity should not be seen as a copying of Western modernity. It's accidental that they have taken all the machines from the West and used their methods and capitalism and so on. But he likes the term Confucian modernity. He says, we have used the Confucian ethic to create Confucian modernity as an alternative and a competitor to Western modernity. We thank them for facilitating it, but we would have done it sooner or later anyway. And this is very, very interesting. And then there is, of course, Islamic claim to universalism, that there is one truth, one ultimate, one whatever, everything, one universal claim, but a very different one. So we at least have on the world stage a Western universalism competing with the Chinese universalism, competing with the Islamic universalism. The question is, I gave a talk in Bangalore in 2003 at the Indian Institute of Sciences, co-sponsored between Infinity Foundation and Templeton Foundation. And my talk was, where is India in this clash of universalisms? That was the talk. So that talk is part of what has turned into this book. Now the interesting thing is that when you tell a Chinese this sort of a thing, in the Chinese education system, they are very clear that they are becoming capitalists, but they are not necessarily losing the idea and the sense of being Chinese. And they are all required to learn English, but as a second language. They're not removing Mandarin in order to bring English. English is coming in addition to Chinese. But the way of thinking and the sense of who we are is very strong. So the book is talking about, is such a project possible for an Indian view, Indian mind, and if so, if it is possible, what might it look like? In a talk I gave at the Vedanta Congress some years ago in UMass, J. Garfield, well-known Buddhist scholar, very sympathetic to India. I was talking about colonization of our appropriations and misappropriations. He raised a question, and he said, but your attitude is going to be bad for India because India is globalizing, becoming very successful as a global power geopolitically and all that stuff. So you will isolate India. If you think of that there is some difference in the Indian way, then you will isolate India. Now this is actually, this mindset represented in this question is actually part of the colonial project, which I think was mentioned by a speaker this morning. To convince people that the colonizers' model is the universal model, and for your own interest you should join in and then you can be part of it, otherwise you will be left out of history. That was Hegel's statement. So I responded back and said, the Chinese are different, want to be different, but they are not isolated anymore. They are part of the global process, but on their own terms. So being different doesn't mean that I don't negotiate with you, I don't transact with you, that I don't compete with you. It means that I haven't lost a sense of who I am. And Japanese are a very good example of being very loyal to who they are and being on the world stage competing. So don't tell me that the two choices are isolationism back in the past where we are orthodox and frozen in old days versus dissolving and becoming a second-grade Western nation in the orbit of the West. I think there's a middle ground where we can have our difference, distinctiveness, and also be very strong and engaged in the global process. Now the definition of my problem is, the problem I face in this project is that if the dharmic traditions have internally among them too much granularity of difference, in other words, if I define the important criteria in such a sharp way that the Vishishtadvait and the Advait cannot be together, and then the Sri Aurobindo cannot be with either of them, and then the Shaivite is different, if that, and the Buddhist has nothing to do with all of these, then I don't really have a standing ground on which I can do the Purva Paksha and the Siddhanta to the West. So I cannot afford too much diversity of views, otherwise there's no central ground. On the other hand, if the position I take is the opposite extreme, that'll be equally bad. If I take a position in the opposite extreme which says all these traditions are the same, and then I say it in very generic things like we should love everybody and God is one and it's a way of life. If I reduce it to very pop culture type of one-liners, then there is nothing distinct with the West either. Then there is nothing left with the West. So in one error, you are not different from the West and everybody is the same and one, which is very fashionable in interfaith circles nowadays. And you get your grants if you go and say, I'm bringing people of all these religions together, we'll have a meeting, we'll have a resolution, and we've made a proclamation of world peace, we have no more problems. You get a lot of people who send you a lot of checks because the philanthropists like to hear that. But it's not realistic. On the other hand, if you are nowhere close to a commonality, too different, then you also have a difference internal to the dharmic traditions. So I have to balance this out, being somewhere in the middle, and not too much on either side, and that is what the book is striving to do. So the problem definition in summary is as follows. I need internally, within the Dharma tradition, commonality across all the dharmas despite the diversity being preserved. So I'm not trying to shoot one down over the other. Diversity has to be preserved. And externally, the question is, what is the limit? The question I ask is, the whole project started because I'm doing a book called U-Turn Theory, which will come out next year, where I look at Westerners who really go into the Hindu tradition or some Buddhist tradition for many, many years of their life, and then some limit is reached, and they cannot go any further. They cannot just become a Hindu or become a Buddhist in a sustainable manner. Something pulls them back to their Judeo-Christian identity. So I wanted to find out what is the U-turn moment? What is the limit to acceptability and assimilation beyond which it is not acceptable? Why does it happen? So I studied so many people to answer that question. So the issue there is, what is the limit to the Judeo-Christian tradition accepting the dharmic or Indic tradition without distorting the dharmic tradition? You can accept it and say, I'll reinterpret what they mean to suit my narrative and not undermine my narrative. But then what you've done is it's not sincere, because you've distorted the dharmic tradition just to appropriate it. And what happens if, without distortion, if you assimilate a particular facet of the dharmic tradition in such a manner that you can no longer survive as Judeo-Christian, your tradition is undermined? What happens in that case? Yeah. So I'm looking for such irreconcilable differences. I'm sorry, but I'm looking for irreconcilable differences. And to me, that defines the problem. Then we can solve it. But we must first understand what is so distinct that without distortion, it just cannot be assimilated into the other tradition, because that other tradition will be undermined by doing so. Quick example I give, not Hindu oriented, but the status of Jesus in Islam is irreconcilable with the status of Jesus in Christianity. In Christianity, he must be Son of God. It is not good enough that he's a prophet, he's a yogi, he's a rishi, he's a wise guy, because the whole cosmology of the nature of the cosmos, the nature of God, the nature of man, the whole human condition cannot be resolved unless God sends his own son and not just another prophet. So the being son is very critical. But in Islam, Jesus is a wise man, he's one of the greatest prophets, but he cannot be Son of God, because being Son of God would then undermine the claim of Muhammad. So this is the kind of irreconcilable difference I'm looking at, and I look at it vis-a-vis the dharmic traditions and Abrahamic traditions. So to give an example of such a irreconcilable difference, if you look at karma and reincarnation, it cannot be reconciled with original sin and redemption. If this idea that I've had many births and I'll have many more births, it cannot be reconciled with one life with heaven and hell. For one thing, whatever Adam and Eve did can only be is only their karma, and they'll pay for it in their own future lives. The progeny are not responsible. I am not responsible for what Adam and Eve did. Only their future lives, they'll have to pay for it. I'm responsible for what I did in my past life, not what they did. So the biological transmission of karma is not how the karmic system works. Reincarnation is not biological transmission. It's a different kind of a transmission. Second thing is that a person cannot come and be born and say that all of you who are not even born can be absolved of all your karma by doing nothing other than just believing in me. This is not within the Sankhya, this is not permissible, that you cannot have this kind of a redemption methodology. And nor can you say, nor is any karma infinite with eternal damnation as the consequence. No matter what karma you do, it is finite. And you may have to come back thousands of lives, but it is not eternal damnation. So the concept of eternal damnation is not possible within the karma system. So if you do proper discourse as a Siddhanta calls you to do, and as a Purva Paksha calls you to do, which people generally don't have the courage to do, you will have to reach the conclusion that karma, reincarnation, cannot be reconciled with original sin, in either direction. So when I have people who come and ask me, have you been saved? I say, but I was never condemned to begin with. And when people come to me and ask me, have you heard the good news? Which in Christianity means salvation. I say, whoa, have you heard the Hindu good news? And they say, Hindu good news. What is that? I say, Hindu good news is, there is no original sin, we are all originally divine. Because Satchitanand, that is what Satchitanand means. Yeah? So we can respond in an honest debate on what these kind of differences are. So the differences that I'm talking about is, there are 4 families of differences, and that's chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, that is 80% of this book, talks about major differences, each 60, 70, 80 page chapter, and I won't go into what these differences are. You have to buy the book and read it and understand what the differences are. But the methodology of reversing the gaze not only is a well-respected tradition in our culture for a long time, we just forgot it, but even in the West, women reversed the gaze, started the women's movement by reversing the gaze on men and saying, hey, you know, this is how you look at, how we think of you. You've been characterizing us and dominating the discourse all these years, but now we want to tell you how the world looks like from our point of view. That's how the women's movement started. And the blacks started something called whiteness studies. Nell Painter of Princeton, a very dear friend of mine, just published something called The History of White People, and she's given me the right to publish an Indian edition. Actually, I'm going to do that. And that is basically reversing the gaze. The same kind of thing I'm talking about. And gays are doing that. They are saying we want our theology and our philosophy, and we don't have to just sort of go along with things. So, as a result of this Purva Paksha and response, I, in this book, reject many common things, including we are proud that we are easy to assimilate. Indians are very proud that we can be assimilated. I have a problem with that. I talk about remaining different with mutual respect. With mutual respect is very important. And there are Indians who feel very proud that somebody is wearing a bindi and a sari. There must be an appropriation which is superficial and not genuine and deep, but more sort of for looks. I come up with what are the thresholds of appropriation that would be legitimate. What are the criteria? I lay down some definitions for that. And I reject both the extreme of being isolated from globalization and there are some people in India who think that NRIs are not authentic Hindus because they have gone out of India. You've seen some of those people. You know of some of those people. So I don't want to get into that kind of an isolationist extreme, nor the other extreme which says we have to accept Western universalism, otherwise there is no other way. So the final thing is the market for this book. We are doing over a dozen talks in November in India, many audiences. An amazing audience is huge response from Indian industry and business leaders, Indian Institute of Management, young presidents organization who are young corporate presidents. They have called me for a lot of these after reading this because they want to know what is the Indian difference in a global context, because they're always running into Chinese telling them what is Chinese civilizational difference. Japanese have come up with what is Japanese difference, the cultural capital that Japan has. France is very proud that they have some French difference. What is the Indian difference they want to understand from a competitiveness point of view. Of course, I'll be meeting a lot of spiritual groups. One of them is in Haridwar. They're going to launch this. Baba Ramdev is expected to come. So I also want to have a lot of discussions with spiritual leaders on where I disagree with their interpretation and projection of the Dharma in the world today. A lot of secularists, Marxists, people like that. And then Westerners. The book has been endorsed by Christian theologians like Francis Clooney at Harvard, Jesuit. He's endorsed the book, and I look forward to some lively, interesting debates in seminaries. And thank you very much.